Have you ever thought about pre-ordering a game to get early access? I recently felt compelled to open my wallet due to my tendency to be compulsive and impatient. However, thankfully, cooler heads prevailed as I thought more and more about the concept of what I was about to do. I was about to spend more money for access to a game that would release only a few days later, for even less money. Now, if Cyberpunk 2077 and Fallout 76's releases have taught me anything, it's that games these days frequently release incomplete. Day one patches are now less a possibility and more of a mathematical certainty. So why didn't I pull the trigger on pre-ordering? I didn't because the early access release was almost certainly going to be an inferior experience to the same game on its intended release date when the day one patch was deployed. Did this end up happening? Yes, and it fixed the core issues that early access players experienced. Everything from bugged quests, loot balancing, stingy progression systems, and brutal difficulty scaling was largely overcome by a single patch. I played a complete game that those who purchased early access never did, an entirely different and superior experience for less money. This game was Avowed, which released earlier this year. Now don't get me wrong, it is solely your choice how you spend your hard-earned cash. At the end of the day, you get to make those decisions. It's your life, you do you. This video isn't about ridiculing people who purchase early access, more bringing awareness to the considerations that need to be made when engaging with it. My intention is to shine a light on some of the glaring shortcomings and pitfalls of engaging with this marketing ploy that for modern gaming is rooted in a deeply flawed philosophy. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that there are plenty of good reasons for why you might do this. For example, your job might not allow you to play a game on its intended release date, and purchasing early access allows you to enjoy it before you lose your chance. You might be stuck at home for a finite period of time and use early access to enjoy that time with a great game before it ends. Hell, you might even be a content creator trying to make the most of a trending game release and see the pre-order cost as a worthy investment. As we all know, modern game releases often take the less consumer-friendly philosophy of releasing a game and then fixing it later, relying on the hype and anticipation to drive a game's success upon release. When I started writing this section, I began thinking of all the times that this has happened in the past decade, and they're almost too numerous to count. The most glaringly obvious being the two I mentioned in the beginning, Cyberpunk 2077 and Fallout 76. Both of these games promised a whole lot and delivered very, very little upon release. But this list could very easily be extended to many others. Destiny 2 was a train wreck when it released and has been many other times throughout its life. No Man's Sky was anything but what Sean Murray promised it to be, despite now being a great experience. It goes on and on, a story told and retold over and over. We have to some degree been worn down by time to accept the fact that games are released unfinished. Not all of them, mind you. Plenty are released in a complete state, but an equal number are not. My point is not to say that all games will be tantamount to another Fallout 76. My point is that incomplete products released for purchase are not the least bit uncommon in the gaming industry, and we, as consumers, have grown accustomed to this possibility. We still begrudge its existence, but have become less outraged as time goes on. So my question is buying early access via pre-order really worth the risk? The risk of purchasing something at a larger cash amount or a more inferior experience. Again, it is your choice as to whether the risk is worth it for you. That risk will always exist under this marketing scheme. So let's take a look at the Avowed situation as an example.
People don't like you very much, do they? Sent here to the living lands by an emperor who couldn't bother to come himself.
Avowed launched on the 18th of February 2025 and was developed by Obsidian Entertainment. The studio was made famous by titles such as Fallout New Vegas, Grounded, and The Outer Worlds. Avowed's release was completely surrounded by a divisive perception on whether it was any good or not. This in large part due to the unbalanced state it was released in during its advanced launch on the 13th of February, 5 days earlier. The contrast between the sentiment before and after the day one patch is so significant that Avowed's launch has left a cloud of confusion about the quality of the game. Its critics focused on a few key areas: unbalanced difficulty scaling, unbalanced materials economy essential for leveling up, stingy skill point distribution, and an underwhelming story. The day one patch that was released addressed most of these overarching points. An underwhelming story, not necessarily something that is easily rectified. In essence, the patch ensured that players weren't as harshly penalized when fighting higher tier enemies above the current level of the player, reducing the burden of some of the more grindier elements of the game. Thus, many of the pain points relating to leveling suddenly became less burdensome, as it mattered much less whether you were underleveled or not. Think about it this way. If an unbalanced experience made enemies tougher, leveling more grindy, and upgrading gear more labor intensive, the game's shortcomings are going to appear more magnified in large part due to the resentment that you're feeling towards the game's structure. With these barriers to entry for progression removed, the game became an entirely different experience on the day of its intended launch. Had pre-order purchasers waited an extra 5 days, they would have played a much better version of the same game they were so eager to play in the first place, for less money. I've personally rolled credits on the game and overall was very happy with the experience. Avowed offered a dense and beautiful world designed for the curious, rewarding exploration while engaging in exciting combat. Visually, the game is actually really stunning. The Living Lands offers sprawling vistas across varied landscapes, luminescent fungi lighting dark nights filled with ghouls and skeletons and apparitions, and a bright sun highlighting the vibrant features of the land swarmed by magical creatures and victims of the mysterious Dream Scourge. But all of those details were largely praised by early access reviews, its shortcomings focusing more on the aforementioned areas. So let's talk about those specifically. Avowed's difficulty was criticized very heavily in its early access period, in no small part due to its difficulty scaling that is assessed based on a tiered system. The tiers range from 1 to 5, going from common to fine to exceptional, then superb, and finally legendary. If you encounter enemies that are the same rank as your gear, then you won't be penalized in terms of your damage output. However, if they are the tier above your gear level, the enemies feel spongier and hit harder. In the early access period, this penalty was very harsh and made no concessions about your gear being anywhere near close to a particular tier. You were either in the tier or you weren't. And if you weren't going to have a good time. Early access reviews leveled harsh criticism at the severity of those penalties applied between discrepancies in gear and enemy level. Avowed is split into 4 distinct regions that you can explore in your playthrough, and in each of them there is a distribution of enemy levels that help guide the flow of your exploration, fighting easier enemies first and harder enemies later. It feels justified then that Avowed was so harshly criticized on this topic, as the game's design philosophy is so centrally focused on rewarding world exploration. Harsh spikes in enemy difficulty, especially for common enemies, would stifle the game's capacity to express that philosophy through gameplay, forcing you to halt exploration to focus on grinding levels before progressing. A system that forces you to then focus on grinding gear level naturally highlights deficiencies in those systems as well. Reviews then condemned the materials economy, as upgrading weapons and armor is contingent on gathering upgrade materials. Furthermore, skill points were criticized as being insufficient for completing even a single skill tree in a playthrough, which further emphasized the difficulty gap between your character and higher tier enemies, not to mention the shortcomings when it comes to build crafting. On the 18th of February, the day of Avowed's release date and exit from early access, Day 1 patch was deployed that had a particularly important inclusion under community requested fixes. It reads, changed tier penalty system from a hard tier to tier system and made it dynamic based on players' equipment and the tier and sub-tier of the enemy. This single change meant that difficulty scaling was remedied, reducing the previous barriers to entry for exploration and taking subsequent pressure off other core gameplay elements like the materials economy. Having now completed the entire game myself, I can confidently say that I didn't at any point experience this dramatic hike in difficulty scaling, nor any of the subsequent issues regarding upgrade materials or skill point insufficiency. Granted, there were other updates since Day 1, but having played the majority of the game before those patches, I can say that they merely smoothed the gameplay experience over even further, rather than being instrumental to the core issue of difficulty scaling. With that now addressed, on the first day of release, this somewhat made many of those reviews redundant, given that the game that they had reviewed, for all intents and purposes, now no longer existed. Unfortunately, the Day 1 patch did not address critical feedback on Avowed's story. The Living Lands is mired in a political upheaval. the Empire of Adir sending military forces and a mysterious envoy, you the player, to overcome the paracausal phenomenon of the dream scourge that is plaguing the realm. While the political elements were markedly less interesting to me personally, the interplay of the gods that govern Eora yielded enough intrigue to keep me consistently engaged throughout the game. And while I didn't take to the game's companions all that much myself, that is almost entirely made up for by the pure existence of Kai. Even with Marius being a black hole of personality having about as much charm as a soggy shoe, that short little sourpuss. Having said all that, I can confidently recommend Avowed for anyone interested in playing it. It's a deeply enjoyable game with some of the best first-person fantasy RPG combat I've ever played, and a rewarding exploration loop that never became tired throughout my entire playthrough. And while the story isn't the 10 out of 10 knockout we'd all hope it was, it's serviceable and contains enough innate intrigue to keep you engaged until the very end. Avowed is excellent, and is in an incredible state now for PC and Xbox gamers to enjoy. But here's the thing, this short review that I've just articulated of my experience with Avowed was of the Avowed that exists now, not the Avowed that briefly existed between the 13th and 18th of February that was the focus of the overwhelming majority of the reviews that exist now on the internet. That clarification is incredibly important to reiterate because the Avowed that received so much criticism no longer exists. In fact, it didn't exist on its intended release date thanks to the day one patch. The success of the early access pre-order scheme has not gone unnoticed by marketing teams across the gaming industry. If there was any perception that this may subside at some point, boy do I have some news. Many recent high-profile releases took advantage of this approach, including highly praised titles like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle by Machine Games, and even the highly anticipated Silent Hill 2 remake by Bloober Team. But just in the next few months, there is a growing list of games that are continuing to see this as the preferred marketing approach. Doom: The Dark Ages is offering 2 days early access for pre-order. South of Midnight also permitted 2 days early access for pre-order as well. Atomfall released in an early access period for 3 days in advance for the low price of purchasing the deluxe edition. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 is also offering a 3-day early access bonus for its deluxe edition. And even the studio of the great Hideo Kojima has taken the bait with Death Stranding 2 on the beaches, offering an early access incentive 2 days in advance of the intended release coming this June. This isn't a trend that will slow down either. If anything, it'll get increasingly more overt as time progresses, given the advantages that game studios get for demonstrating early market interest in their releases. To reiterate, there's nothing inherently wrong with this marketing scheme, provided that the released product is in a state that reflects the complete product vision of the game studio that made the game. If there's anything less than that, then you've been intentionally misled, leading you to purchasing a game for more than the full price that isn't up to the standard of the intended release. It's the gaming equivalent of purchasing a product from Wish. Great in the pictures, awful in real life. There is one other point that I want to make in anticipation of people thinking I'm condemning the early access program for games that has existed for a very long time. Games that release into early access are done so for a few potential benefits. First, the developers get access to live playtesters that they can gather feedback from and incorporate into their game to perfect over time. Second, developers might choose this path to get access to critical funds to continue development, offering their game at a lower price to compensate for the incomplete state it is releasing in. And third, it can be a powerful marketing tool to raise awareness of the game's release, which can then drive more into financing and user testing. This program has been wildly successful for some incredibly well-known titles that I'm certain you've at least heard of. This includes games like Hades, Subnautica, and even Baldur's Gate 3. But I'm not talking about this program. The discussion in this video is isolated just to incentives in pre-order bonuses, not the early access program. Buying into early access under this program, more often than not, comes with a cheaper price tag, not a more expensive price tag, despite often still being an incomplete version of the game. Now, it might seem like I'm drawing closer and closer to a potentially derivative statement like pre-ordering games for early access makes no sense and it's a scam, blah, 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 but that isn't my point at all. The central thesis of this video is to say buying early access via pre-order is a thing now, and it's here to stay, but it's hiding the deeply flawed parts of the gaming industry's trend for releasing unfinished games. There is absolutely nothing wrong with engaging with this system. It's your money and it's your choice. But if you do, History will tell us that there's a strong chance you're going to experience disappointment playing the game that you were so eager to play, you paid a higher cost so you didn't have to wait any longer. My advice, review the developer and their track record for delivering games to a high standard on their intended release date. If you feel that it's worth the gamble for you, then take the plunge. Otherwise, learn from the short history of modern gaming, where day one patches are a dime a dozen and pre-ordering early access is fraught with the risk of disappointment.